Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, Letty.
Thank you. Welcome to today's webinar, and all protocols are hereby observed. My name is Letty Tembolongwe, and I work at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies. Welcome again. We were giving it another few minutes, hoping that more people will join, but they will just to find us on the way. Now, you may recall that the 9th Tana Forum held in a hybrid format last year was on the African Continental Free Trade Area. And one of the outcomes from this forum was the need for continuous dialogue on the implementation mechanisms of the Continental Free Trade Area. To this effect, the Institute of Peace and Security Studies, IPSS, as well as GIZ Corporation, German corporation, decided to organize this forum where we hope the discussions will dig deeper into what implementation steps has been put in place, which African countries are already trading with each other, and if at all the current, they've taken advantage to use the Continental Free Trade Area to mitigate against the current COVID-19 emergencies, for instance, moving of medicines and the personal protective challenges that has been experienced so far on the continent. There are also so many comments out there in the media and public spaces that the Continental Free Trade Area has failed even before it has started. Perhaps today's webinar will also dig into that, look at the current challenges and setbacks, if any, and also perhaps put some recommendations on any mitigation measures that can be put in place. These hopefully will be some of the issues that we hope today's webinar will help us unpack in the nexus of multilateralism. The Continental Free Trade Area is our tool. We need to make it work. We're looking forward to trade between African countries and development prosperity across the continent. It should be given the means to succeed. Without further ado, I'll now hand over to the moderator so that she can take us through the business of the day. Shivai, I hand over to you and I declare this event open. Over to you, Shivai.
Good afternoon. I assume everyone is in the afternoon where they're joining us from, but if you're joining us and it's evening time or morning time, good morning and good evening to you. My name is Shivai Busmanyoni, and I am the director of the African Leadership Center. And it's my pleasure to participate in this post-Tana Virtual Multi-Stakeholders Forum on the role of multilateralism on the effective implementation of the AfCFTA, the African Free Trade Agreement. So let me join Letty once more in welcoming you all, especially to this first panel, where we will be looking at multilateralism in Africa and its role in the implementation of the African Free Trade Agreement. As I said, my name is Shivai, and I work at the African Leadership Center based in Nairobi in Kenya, and we work on issues at the nexus of peace, security, and development. And so this is a very critical issue to us and something that we have been looking at in various ways, or various of my colleagues who are researchers have been looking at this. Our work is primarily with young people, with those who we see as the future leaders on the continent in some of these areas. And so this conversation is really pertinent in that sense. On our panel this afternoon, we should be joined by two speakers. I see one of them here on the floor, and I'm not sure perhaps the colleagues from IPSS can assist with our second speaker. But we have His Excellency Ambassador Mohammad Ali Guyo from IGAD, and he is the Special Envoy on the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, and Somalia. And we also have due to speak with us today, Ms. Bethlehem Arega, who is a Senior Legal Advisor for the AfCFTA Secretariat. And colleagues from IPSS, perhaps you can indicate if Ms. Bethlehem is here and if she will be joining us. But I don't want to take too much time. I think Letty has already assisted in outlining some of the conversations that took place in last year's virtual or hybrid forum, Tana Forum, and some of the questions that emerged and that are also critical as we think about implementation of the AfCFTA and also multilateralism and its role in this. I think some of the key terms that have come up and some of the words which I would like to hear our panelists speak about are things like collective responsibility. When we think of multilateralism, we think about collective responsibility. Where does that fit in from a continental perspective when we think about implementing this free trade agreement? Letty also spoke about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. But at the same time, I think there was a lot of conversation on how the COVID-19 pandemic offers a range of opportunities for African countries and for the continent in relation to implementing this free trade agreement. Political will is another term that was bandied about. And we hear this many times and often in the multilateral space or even at a continental and regional level. When we think especially about peace and security, when we think about many of the crises and conflicts that bedevil our continent, we hear the term political will used a lot. But what does this mean when we think about multilateralism and its role in implementing the African Free Trade Agreement? We also talked and heard about voice, the role of voice, when we now transpose the African context or the African Free Trade Agreement within a global setting or a global context, and we think about things like institutions like the World Trade Organization and the role of the continent there. What do we mean when we talk about voice, and what are the needs, and what do we think about the future of issues like voice and agency for the African continent? So these are just some of the thoughts that I think we can attend to in the next sort of 30 minutes as we hear from our esteemed panelists. I'm going to ask His Excellency Ambassador Mohamed Ali from IGAD, if he could make some remarks in relation to this topic of ours on multilateralism in Africa and its role in the implementation of the AfCFTA. Looking also, Your Excellency, at issues that relate to collective responsibility. What does this mean? What has this meant, for instance, for IGAD in the kind of role you played? Also, what is the place of voice and agency for Africans? Ambassador Ali Guyo, I will ask you to also just say a little bit more about yourself than what I have said, which is that you're the special envoy for IGAD on the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, and Somalia. And I'll hand over the floor to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much indeed, Shubai, for this introduction. And also, I take this opportunity to thank the Tana Forum organizers for the invitation. And I'm also extend my pleasure to be amongst the distinguished participants, moderators, and speakers today. My name, of course, as you introduced, Mohamed Ali Guyo, IGAD Special Envoy for Somalia, Red Sea, and Gulf of Aden. I work with IGAD. I've dealt with a number of issues to do with peace processes, the Sudan peace process, which was one of the pioneer, groundbreaking conflict resolution by IGAD. Which led to comprehensive peace agreement for Sudan, that led to self-determination for South Sudan. Also, I was involved with South Sudan peace process from 2013 all the way up to 2015. Previously, I worked as Director for Peace and Security in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Kenya. And now Special Envoy to Somalia. Now, to begin with, I was also asked to present, just to provide a highlight on behalf of one of the panelists who is not here with us today because of other urgent engagement, that is His Excellency Abdoulaye Diop. So basically, what he was supposed to cover was multilateral rhetoric, action, and importance to nation state. It is clear to all of us, I will not say anything new as such, that the global governance, among others, have been defined by multilateral organizations. So multilateralism has been the heart that pushes the global village, so to speak, a rhetoric which is always out there. But multilateral institution is also a creature of nation state. So in terms of power relation, you find that nation state still wield a lot of power over multilateral organizations. But multilateralism is about our collective endeavors. It is about the power of a whole rather than parts. So it is a power of putting together our strengths in order to mitigate our weaknesses. And multilateralism in this regard, therefore, it rests on principles that defines its aspiration, which sometimes is also characterized by certain rhetorics. This rhetoric is about big promise by multilateral institution that tries to engage in a cooperative framework. The defining feature of these multilateral principles, among others, is about solidarity. This is the big word that is out there. It's about the rule of law. It's about equality of nations. It's about inalienable rights of all nations. These are principles which are out there that is championed by multilateral organizations. In fact, in Africa, especially in the Horn of Africa, there is high optimism for multilateralism because we have seen this, it has worked, it has faced its own challenges, but it continues to work. There is a qualitative progress, and this progress can be defined as follows. The transformation of Organization of Africa Unity to Africa Union. This is indeed a big leap. The transformation of Intergovernmental Authority on Drought and Desertification to Intergovernmental Authority on Development is another leap. Given the state formation process and low appetite in multilateralism in the Horn of Africa, the founding fathers of IGAD decided to seek refuge in environmental factors like drought and desertification in order to come up with some kind of a cooperative framework. That is IGAD, that is Intergovernmental Authority on Drought and Desertification. That is, they went for issues of law politics. But after the Cold War, Intergovernmental Authority on Development came up. IGAD, WD, was highly transformed to issues of high politics, dealing with peace and security. But this is still work in progress. This is still work in progress. The Continental Free Trade Area is one of those revolutionary aspirations that has also captured attention of IGAD on how to mitigate some of the differences so that we are able to move beyond bilateral relations among member states and try to take refuge in this Continental Free Trade Area in order to have a cooperative framework on trade and economic integration. This is still work in progress in IGAD, As you know, IGAD region is the least regionalized region in Africa. So it's work in progress for us. But I believe that internal environment within the member states, however challenging, however fragile, together with external environment, whereby great power competition, investment promotion, big infrastructure development within the region, among the member states and also within the region, look at the BRI and others. These are all some of the things that we believe provide an environment, important environment for our multilateral endeavor, especially in terms of cooperation within the region. So as I said, we are in a globalized world, globalized environment. And this globalized environment comes with so many factors that has also defined and redefined how we view nation states and how we view our multilateral institutions. Look at, for example, social media, which has redefined territorial integrity, including even sovereignty of states. Look at, for example, global mobility, that is regular and irregular migration, and what this entails eventually. Is this a global village in making? It is a question that we can put out there. So multilateral progress is not uniform. ECOWAS is different from IGAD, different from SADC, different from ECAS. Because of our history, because of our politics, because of geopolitics, because of the nature and history of our nation, formation of nation states. So this progress is quantitative and qualitative. It is still work in progress. It is still work in progress. But the most important thing now is for us to focus positively on our achievements and mitigate our challenges. It's important for us to do that. With this, there is need to move beyond multilateral organization being seen as government-centered, state-centered, to people-centered. Participation of people is very important. Why is it important? Because people confer legitimacy to these organizations. So the question is, how do we move from government-centered approach to multilateral organization to people-centered approach? How can the people own this organization? How can this organization bypass nation state and deal and be felt and be visible at the grassroots level? This is very critical. IGAD has already done that with the emergence of COVID-19, and it is still work in progress. I will do that in the second session when I come to my part. So this multilateral organization, therefore, have to be people-centered. Public participation is very critical. As we know, our people are now highly politicized. They are highly energized. They are yearning for democratization, good governance, accountability, and transparency. What is the promise of multilateral organization in all these important elements? So having said that, the rhetoric, of course, is there. What I've done is just to reflect, to provide a reflection. But what is the reality? We have heard about the perspective that I've provided, but what is the reality on the ground? Multilateral organization can be dismissed as a talk shop, Good principles that has been espoused has not been translated into as a basis of action. So we have rhetoric here, we have good principle here, but we are lacking action. Therefore, collective aspiration should translate to collective action. But while multilateral rhetoric, of course, sometimes is seen as, you know, something elusive, but it is still better than nothing because it gives us hope. It's a basis of hope. It's not just enough for our organization to come for a meeting and heads of state and government come up with, you know, they condemn, for example, when certain atrocities or certain things has happened within the member state. But there needs to be basis for action, basis for sanction and interventions, especially in complex political emergencies. Therefore, it is important that we try to balance the rhetoric and action, and we also need to tap the energy of our member states and also the dynamics of the people within the member state for us to move beyond principles and then deal with the action. Now, when I come to the IGAD, the lesson learned by IGAD in intervention on COVID-19 as one of the regional economic bloc, I want to start by, first of all, appreciating the fact that IGAD region is least regionalized. IGAD region has a complex geopolitics. IGAD region, of course, is fragile in many sense. Lots of fragile states in Africa are in the Horn of Africa region. And of course, IGAD region state formation process has not been easy, it has been complex. And this is a region, by the way, that has tested the limits of modern state system, because it is a region of self-determination, is a region of secession, is a region that is still work in progress. With this kind of dynamic, therefore, you know, the multilateral collective action become a big challenge. Despite that, the leaders, our leaders, are able to have this convening power. Every time issues come up, there is a convening power that they master and provide political and diplomatic capital together with the goodwill of each member state in order to navigate some of these challenges we face in this region. For example, the IGAD region was amongst the first to deal with, or rather to come up with a framework of engagement or intervention on COVID-19. As you know, on 30th March 2020, last year, IGAD heads of state and government, IGAD ministers of health and finance, took into consideration that the evolving situation of COVID-19 remain a looming threat to health and security. And in this regard, IGAD developed COVID response strategy, which was endorsed for action. And it is still a basis that guides us in our engagement in this region. And by the way, it is also becoming one of those reference documents by our other regional bloc. So what are some of the achievements we had is IGAD Secretariat was able to form a special regional task force on COVID-19 and also came up with a fund, regional fund, emergency fund for COVID-19. IGAD was also able to coordinate with the Africa Union Continental Response to COVID-19, and of course participating in all the meetings. And our ministers for health and finance, they went even beyond COVID COVID-19 health issue, but also came up with a socio-economic response framework that we are implementing in our sub-region. So IGAD has also invested in the COVID-19 response to strengthen regional and national health system, especially across the border, in order to cement the integration of communities that is going on across the frontiers of the IGAD member states. IGAD also has undertaken advocacy and resource mobilization, and this in itself has been a key driver of sustaining and also bringing up predictable, sustainable, and to some extent sufficient resources to deal with the COVID-19 and also its impact on socio-economic. IGAD has also explored digital solution relevant to COVID health response and promoted it, and which was adopted by our member states. And above all, IGAD is also in the process of acquiring COVID-19 vaccine response plan, a response which has been shared with the member state in order to complement the effort of our member states. As a way forward, of course, we are institutionalizing the Regional Emergency Operation and Coordination Unit that has been very effective to some extent for this COVID-19. And we're also building network of private partnership initiative in order to enhance public participation and ownership so as to supplement government effort. And we are also enhancing the role of media in supporting response to public health emergencies. So that is what IGAD has done. That's what IGAD has done. I think I have about 5 minutes still. That is what IGAD has done. But
can
now,
I ask you to wrap up in 2 minutes?
Yes, I'll do it in 2 or 3 minutes. Okay.
Thank you.
What are some of the key lessons that we have learned? That's what IGAD has done. What are some of the key lessons? The lesson is that the COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us about our vulnerability and reminded us also the centrality of multilateralism. This is important. That also in the era of globalization, health matters a lot, because even if you develop your elaborate health system, still, if other parts of the world is vulnerable, then even the high-tech health system can be highly affected. This one is example all over the world. The COVID-19, of course, has challenged. It's one of those transfrontier. It is a global pandemic. It requires collective effort and collective action, which like what IGAD has done. And then it has also reminded us that your best partners are always your neighbors. And also international solidarity matters. This is also important because some of the support we received so far is also from other parts of the world. Goodwill from leaders, political and diplomatic capital is also key and very important. Time to act swiftly is also key in order to resolve some of these crises. So we have to also look at the global pandemic of this disease, and the local reality is also very important. Cross-border facilitation is important. Border management, one border stop, how do we facilitate this also becomes important. So there is need for a debt moratorium in order for some of our member states, the vulnerable one, to be able to sustain their economy and also try to respond to COVID-19 once the death burden is alleviated. Global solidarity, multilateral cooperation is still essential in sustaining mitigation of COVID-19. So there's a big gap of course, in health coverage across the world, but universal health coverage remains important for across the world. So I've said a lot of things, so we'll be able to have time for interactive discussion if possible. And thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency Ambassador Mohammad Ali, who is the Special Envoy for IGAD in the Red Sea, and who has really outlined for us, taken us through quite a tour, I think, of multilateralism, the experiences with it, of it in the Horn region, and also some of the progress that has been made and some key lessons. And I think you pointed out some very critical things. One of the things I held on to is this idea of the complex nature of state formation, the state formation process in the region, and I think in other parts of the continent, and its relationship, or how it sits alongside multilateralism, how it has depended on multilateralism, but at the same time shaped the trajectory of multilateralism in the region. And then I think fundamentally, you raised the issue of people, citizens, and their role in many of these processes that are created, designed at a regional or continental level. I think what is interesting, especially about the Horn region that you have used based your examples on, is that at the people-to-people level, there is exchange, there is, across borders. But yet there are challenges around the state-to-state exchanges around borders, and I hope you'll be able to speak to that a little bit more later when we have our Q&A about how, especially this process of the Continental Free Trade Agreement could benefit from the existing people-to-people relations already in the region. But now allow us to move on. Bethlehem Arega, who is a senior legal advisor for the AfCFTA Secretariat. Bethlehem, you have 10 minutes, please, to speak to our topic and to even respond to some of what has already been put on the table. Bethlehem, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Excellencies. It's actually still morning in Accra, but good afternoon for everyone who's on the other side. And thank you very much for organizers and everyone that has invited the CFTA to be part of this this meeting. Is my internet still on?
Yes, it's on. We can see you and we can hear you. Yes.
Okay, it just showed me that it was weak connection. So in our intervention, I'm sure there are also other colleagues of mine that would be speaking in the other sessions, but my intervention will be on the social responsibility and the role that the AfCFTA would have in terms of ensuring multilateralism is applied, and to also see some of the lessons learned from the COVID-19 and the importance of political role. Also, just to speak on the comment that you made earlier, we do see that there had been a bit of a delay in implementation of the CFTA, and this was highly affected by COVID-19 happening. But the way we see it is that the glass is half full and not half empty, and there have been actually remarkable commitments and remarkable progresses that we have witnessed. And I think that's also the biggest takeaway. When we look at the European Union and the other free trade areas, we see that it took them 50 years, 60 years, 70 years to even get where they are today. I'm not saying we should be taking that long, but the takeaway is that we are on a good start, and the numbers will speak for themselves. I'm more going to speak on the numbers, and I think that's the takeaway I would want this meeting to have. So in terms of the numbers, the ratification number, as you know, has one of the highest numbers of ratifications. The signing, 54 African countries, with the exception of Eritrea, have already signed. At the moment, we have 38 ratifications, with the last of which being Democratic Republic of Congo, who just deposited their instrument of ratifications. In addition to this, we have 42 countries representing 76% of the African AU membership and 33 countries representing 60% of the AU membership that have submitted their schedule of tariff and their schedule of specific commitments to the AfCFTA, to the Secretariat. Of course, these are now documents that will be under negotiations during the second phase, but member states are really complying with the submission of these schedules of tariffs. We have also received submissions from custom unions such as the EAC, the CEMAC, ECOWAS, and SACU. When we look at the trade and services, we also see that 33 countries have proposed their initial offer, and this includes also offers from 12 state parties and 2 regional economic communities. On the rules of our origin, we have a similar good coverage where 86% of the total tariff line has been met. It is expected that in the following few weeks that we will be having a back-to-back meetings of the specialized bodies and the Council of Ministers. Well, now these negotiations will commence, and we are hopefully we will be presenting these documents to the Assembly, where now this will be the integral part of the AfCFTA agreement. So I think this is also one of the biggest economic integration that has happened since colonialization is over in the continent. Because of this big move, there's also a number of challenges that will come related to this idea of moving from dismantling a colonial economic model, which moves from Africa as a supplier to Africa as a value-added manufacturing goods. So the challenge we accept is there also because the fundamental system that was put in every African country is completely different from what we are trying to implement at AfCFTA. The agreement also foresees that although 38 of the member states have already ratified and have committed themselves to the multilateral agreement, there will be moves here and there that will be slow and implementation will not be at the same pace. And in a sense, that's also provided for in our agreement, where now member states will be allowed a bit of room for liberalization of their economies in the pace that they want to go. And this flexibility is also permitted in various free trade agreements, as it is in our AfCFTA agreement. We also recognize that while in the long run, the CFTA is going to be quite useful for all African countries, in the short run, there would be countries that would be highly disadvantaged because of the system putting in place. So in the near term, there will be disruptions to industries. Small business companies might be affected. The change of regulations will undoubtedly affect some of the existing companies. So in terms of finding a solution to that, what the CFTA has done is now come up with an adjustment fund, an adjustment facility for the CFTA, where now this provides a mechanism where state parties will be able to get financial and technical support from to their businesses, and through a system that is created and put in place to help ease the near-term disruption that will be associated to the implementation. So this fund, as it stands, has already received $1 billion from the Afrexim Bank as a money that has been put in, and will now in the long run also be attracting more investors to come in. The way we foresee it is that while some part of the adjustment fund will be funded by member states, a whole part of it will be concession loans, it would be grants and similar fundings, where investors will now be invited to put in their money to support these systems. So when changes are happening, we are also now supporting that change in countries and member states, and also small companies that will be affected will be able to benefit from it. Of course, there will be regulations that member states would have to show that their system is affected, but that is one of the implementation mechanisms that we are putting in place, and the discussion of this document is already at a very extended level. The Assembly has already endorsed it. We're working on the statute and the mobilization plan, which is supposed to be endorsed by the Assembly. As it stands, though, already the fact that we have such an endorsement has created so much attraction from big insurance companies, from banks in the continent, who are now coming up with similar initiatives as AfCFTA to put in money and now also benefit from this unique opportunity that we have in the continent. For the other point that we see from multilateralism is that we have seen, and the importance of it is during COVID. When COVID hit the continent, and as His Excellency has said, one of the things that we have been able to identify is the fragility of the system that we have on the grounds, and the fact that our health systems are indeed in need of improvements. And in some cases, the economic gaps was very large that a lot of our governments have suffered, the economic and the humanitarian aspects of it as well. So beyond the immediate effect, there is a need for us to see as the CFTA as a platform to implement government's collective interests to avail timely, universal, and equitable healthcare system, and by building their infrastructures, because we see the AfCFTA treaty also as a developmental instrument that we have put in place. And this can be supported by governments putting in place the structural reforms, and the adjustment facility and other facilities that we're putting in place are intended to support these kind of initiatives, such as the COVID one. Even though the African continent has acted very quickly to combating COVID, we've also seen how our countries have suffered in getting PPEs and getting vaccines and the ongoing back and forths to get these, which also brings us back to the main issue, the issue of the importance of strengthening our value chains, because the problem of having of lack of access is also because we are highly invested in export-oriented supplies of medicines and not investing in manufacturing any one of them. To this, we have also seen, and this is a lesson that we've learned from the COVID-19, is the role of political commitment and how relevant it is to ensure that our actions are taken on board. I say this because since COVID broke in March 2021, the African Union has taken a number of steps where now we are way further in a better position that we would have been if the political wills did not come. Just to give you a few examples of that, for example, when COVAX announced vaccine availability to the continent, we were told only 20% of the African continent will be able to benefit from vaccines, while the studies show that only the way to reach immunity in the continent, immunization of the continent, is if you vaccinate 60% of the continent. So in this case, what African Union did is took matters into his own hands and said, okay, 60% of the population needs to be vaccinated. You're only giving us 20% of these vaccines. What do we do about the 40% that's missing? This is where we brought in and also brokered a deal with big banks again, and also companies like MTN and the others, where now the gaps of that 40% and the capacity to buy of our member states was able to be covered. This, of course, doesn't solve everything, because even though now we have put in the money, we're being told that there aren't enough vaccines to reach this part of the world, and reaffirms the importance of manufacturing capacity and development of value chain. COVID was also a moment that has motivated legislative change and certain kinds of movements in international trade agreements. And this is in regards to the TRIPS agreement and flexibility that has been requested by the African continent towards the patents of vaccines. You will also recall there were several requests during the outbreak of HIV, where India and South Africa also led several of these requests, and at the end, at least now it has gone so much further than when we were there. The US is backing it now. We of course understand the WTO process is more complex than that, but this is also something that leaves room to show when our investment protocol is going to be negotiated, when our intellectual property legal instrument is being negotiated, which is the second phase of AfCFTA. These are matters that we should make sure that we clarify in our own instruments. And moving forward, the fact that a continent can move together and say, these are the right to life, and you cannot now be putting a patent to the protection of, as opposed to protecting the people, is a very strong statement that I think in the long run would create a lot of positive impacts. There are a number of other activities in regards to COVID that has already been done also on the continent. This includes the creation also of a platform of, it's called AVAT, where now vaccine acquisition was brokered through the private sector, which came on board with money and said, we have put in this amount of money, we have put together our investments, and we want to work with the African Union. So what the African Union did is moved from the usual donors conference that we used to have of asking for money to investing our energy into the private sector. So now investors, billionaires like Steve Maseawe came on board to say, we will assist you and help the continent in acquiring these vaccines, while the business sector also has a platform. We also created what we call a medical supply platform, where every country was able to have an interface where purchase of medical commodities was made available online, and onboarding of health commodities for prevention and care of COVID medicine was bought at a voluminous and reduced rate, which allowed for African manufacturers also to display their products. It also created a platform where these documents, where these it would guarantee the certification process, which means now in the long run, these are the kind of platforms our member states would be using. This system was available to all member states, so whenever they made their purchase, it came through that system, and a number of countries, including South Africa, Rwanda, were able to put out their products of medical equipment, which would not have ever seen that they had an interaction with the rest of the world through that system. So I think this is also an excellent opportunity that in the long run would help us in achieving more. Overall, I think what we want to do comes down to four things. The four things is the efforts in the continent, we believe, should be reoriented and be together with the AfCFTA implementation plan. We want to avoid any duplications that happen in the continent. The RECs are one of our the strongest implementation arms that we have in the continent, and any of their efforts also should be coordinated under the umbrella of AfCFTA, which now helps us to speak in the same manner, because trade is not just about trade. Like I said, it's about development, it's about medical care, it's about a lot of things that touch upon everyday life of every citizen. So I think it's important that we reorient all our efforts towards implementation of AfCFTA. The second is to support the economic reforms and the regional value chains. And that, like I said, it has an overreaching goal of implementing the AfCFTA agreement. There's also a need to establish a robust system that also allows for that to happen. And the fallouts that we have seen in COVID-19 could trigger trade reforms that go just beyond removal of tariffs, but include services, e-commerce, and so forth. The introduction of adjustment facilities, like I mentioned earlier, is something that could support these kind of reforms. The third is the engagement of the private sector. We've seen that being the strongest world economy, and because if you look at Africa as a continent, it's the fifth largest GDP, with Japan, China, the US, and one other country before it. So if we stop looking at African countries as individuals and tie them down to the AfCFTA, then the private sector will also have more interest to invest into the continent and also strengthen our system. Lastly, like I mentioned, all of this can only be possible when we have the political commitment and the engagement of member states to support our process. I believe that it's there, even with the whole pandemic, where a lot of our countries were highly affected. Their commitment to the implementation of CFTA has been amazing. We have been holding our meetings since COVID started, in a hybrid form, where member states have insisted actually that the negotiations of phase 2 does not get delayed. So this is my message. I'm happy to come back and intervene as needed. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Bethlehem, for taking us through the fascinating work that the Secretariat has already done, your achievements so far in implementation and working within this multilateral system. I think what two key things that I'm taking away from what you have said, the one is around just the adjustments that have had to be made in order for, so seeing ahead and seeing some of the fallout, some of the gaps, and trying to adjust to ensure that those gaps are made smaller. And also your point about, actually seeing come to fruition the objective of the free trade agreement, which is around value chains and development manufacturing from the continent. So a question for you as we go into the Q&A is, you mentioned this adjustment facility, and it seems to me that a lot of the focus is on, even when you talk of private sector, is on what we would consider formal business, formal private sector, the private sector whose shares we can identify and count on the stock exchange in whichever country. But I'm wondering about those who we would consider not necessarily informal, but those who are represented perhaps by by the kind of community level associations, business associations, and the extent to which these adjustment facilities are also taking those kinds of businesses, those kinds of entities into account. If we drive around many African cities now, after the last sort of 12 months we have had, we see the impact and the effect that COVID-19 has had on business, has had on manufacturing, has had on trade. And so that's one question. The second question is around what you raised about manufacturing and value chains, and how does a process, a mechanism, an entity such as the AfCFTA use the lessons learned from multilateralism to date, many of which Ambassador Ali has already outlined? How do you use those lessons to actually move the conversation and the implementation where we can see tangible results? So all this money that private sector has put in, how can we move the conversation away from purchasing of vaccines, acquiring vaccines, to putting that into our development and research units across the continent to actually say this is the vaccine that the continent has developed itself? So that's just something I'm throwing to you, along with other questions. And Ambassador Mohammad Ali, I hope you're back with us, because we have a couple of questions so far in the chat. The one that I'll put to you, Ambassador, is Dr. Adiat Abiodun is asking, how can the lack of political will, which has been a major problem against the success of multilateralism in Africa, be addressed? And I think, Ambassador, you'd already started talking about a key lesson being political and diplomatic goodwill and how that can be leveraged. So Dr. Adiat is asking, how can the lack of political will, which has been a major problem against the success of multilateralism in Africa, be addressed? To you, Bethlehem, there is a question from Ibrahim Muhammad, who is saying that if we use COVID-19 as an example, we can see the competitive behavior between states. So Bethlehem, you've talked to us about a lot of cooperation, collaboration, and working together. But there is also the other side of it, that there is competitive behavior between states because of national interest. So, and then also we see this in the negative propaganda against the vaccine. So the question is, what are efforts to bring states to common ground in order for a more regional and a more continental approach to some of these issues? I know you've given us some examples, but maybe there's something more you'd want to add to that, Bethlehem. So as we wait for additional questions, and please do put your questions in the chat for you, all participants. Let's turn over to Ambassador Mohammad Ali to just give us a few responses. I'll give you 3 minutes each, and then we can take another round of questions if there's any.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Lack of political will is a very serious impediment to multilateral institution, because basically the nation state always pursue their vested national interest. So how do we reconcile the national interests of our member states in order to overcome some of these challenges? So this is where we need to develop some kind of a catalog of common understanding and points of differences, you know, in order for us to see where the differences are. However, sometimes national interests are not clearly defined. It's just something out there assumed, you know, so therefore we need to address it in a structured way in order to overcome this political will. There is need to address it in a structured way in an institutional format, and above all also bring people, bring stakeholders, multi-stakeholders of course into this. It should not just be about political decision makers, but it should be about collective action that the people also accompany their leaders in making some of these decisions. If you look at cross-border, for example, the integration there, the kind of relation across the border has outpaced the relation at the capital cities. Within our capitals, they are still far behind. But at the borders, politically, they are integrated, economically, and so on, to some extent, culturally. So therefore, I think we need to bring with us other stakeholders in order for us to overcome some of these challenges. But above all, national interest is what always what always militate against our collective endeavor. Thank you. Over.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Can I press you a little bit more? You know, so you've said very, I mean, I think you've captured it excellently that at the borders, for instance, the integration is a lot deeper, is far deeper than in the capitals or in the parliaments or the cabinets where many of these decisions are taken and made. What mechanisms or through what processes could we take those lessons of multilateralism, if you want to call it, to where it should make a difference at a policy level? I don't know if you've done any thinking around this, but what would that actually look like? That we are seeing what is working, and it is being it is being integrated into these more formal policy-related governance or government type of processes. Sorry, you're on mute, Ambassador.
Sorry. You see, this issue of collective action, multilateral, is a multidimensional, you know, venture. It touches on each and every aspect of the people, the government, and everything. So I think the most important thing is it requires a whole government approach. A whole government approach in terms of even parliamentary engagement. How can our governments be able to not only the executive, but the entire government structure and system be engaged in order to benefit from this? But also, I think there's need for the business community. You know, if you want to resolve conflict, you know, you go to business community. If you want to have good governance, because business benefit a lot from stability, and business also is about economy of scale, and therefore it is important that the business community, those key stakeholders, be part and parcel of this policy making process. So the policy making process should be dispersed, you know, within the population, the people, the private sector, and everyone, so that all of them will be able to contribute and will be able to. Who is executive? If all of these stakeholders accompany this multilateral process or policies? Who are they? So they are just 1% or few percentage of, at the end of the day, they are political decision makers, but with accountability, with the transparency, with good governance, with the structured engagement. I've captured it, but over to you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. We'll come back to you with one other question I've seen, but we'll go to Bethlehem now and hear some of her input. Bethlehem, over to you.
Thank you very much. Just to answer the question that has been raised in terms of the private sector, for us actually at the AfCFTA, and also if you see the recent decisions of member states, the focus are 3 points. The one is supporting the SMEs, youth, and women. So actually, while I have been speaking about the big private sector companies that have been supporting us and the billionaires, the aim is that we will be able to broker and be a platform where now the SMEs will be able to benefit from commercial loans. They will be able to grow their business because over 80% of a rough estimate of over 80% of our businesses in the continent are actually based on SMEs. So speaking about the big, heavy investors in the continent, without necessarily linking them to the SMEs and the others would absolutely make no sense and will not help in the implementation of the CFTA. So for us, the way we see the big investors in the continent, the big multilateral companies, is that they will be supporting the SMEs, they will be supporting youth with various ideas and investment ideas that they're bringing, and they will be supporting women in the same efforts. From the CFTA side, we've also been trying to digitalize create a digitalization system for a various number of SMEs, and the goal is that now we will start rolling that out throughout the continent, while member states will be able to implement in their countries. Implementation, like I said, will not be at the same level because we have big countries and big economies like Egypt, South Africa, complex economy, and you also have countries like Rwanda, where the countries are small but complex economies are also developing there. So the resistance will be there in as far as countries will be facing those the short-term disadvantages, as I mentioned. So the way we see the adjustment funds coming in is actually to support those small businesses that will be extinct because of the coming into force of AfCFTA. How can we organize them? How can we find a way to support the core of our businesses, which are basically SMEs in the continent? So the hope is that in creating a mechanism that digitalizes SMEs, in creating a mechanism that recognizes their existence and creates a platform where they can benefit from commercial loans from these big companies is how we will be supporting the AfCFTA. Of course, implementation of the ground will also be influenced with how far member states want to take these kind of opportunities. The manufacturing and value chains. The manufacturing, I think for me, like I said, the starting point should always be, a central point should be AfCFTA, and everything should revolve around it. Because if you see now the efforts that are being done by Africa CDC, the medical pharmaceutical companies, our treaty on African Medical Agency, which aims to establish an agency that produces vaccines and any other medical cares in the continent, are all going to be interlinked. We cannot be seeing trade as a different matter from health. We cannot consider it separately from human rights. We cannot separate it from other parts of legal or developmental aspects. So in a sense, it's not just that we will be driving the implementation agenda, but what we will be also expecting is that the regional economic communities in undertaking their day-to-day activities will be taking into consideration and aligning themselves to the AfCFTA. And that has already been made possible because our July summits address a mid-year coordination summit where now heads of regs come together and see how they can harmonize their regulations on the ground and create a more feasible platform for all the companies to grow. So the lessons learned from all this is that we believe there's strength in power, there's strength in coming under the umbrella of the AfCFTA, and bringing together all our efforts to also align to that will ensure that we do things differently than they were done in the past. And like I mentioned, the SMEs will of course have to be at the central role of how we continue to grow the continent, because even when we see countries like Germany, the biggest developmental concepts and developmental aspects were put on place because of the SMEs that have now grown up to be to a larger extent. So the goal when I mentioned all these big companies is more or less to interlink them and also create that platform where people will need to invest. Because we're not just looking at people who will be able to benefit from these concessions, from the commercial loans, but rather also Africans who will be able to invest into the continent and see the value in investing in it, really. So I think those are the two questions. I'm not sure if I've fully addressed the concerns, but yeah.
Thank you so much. Bethlehem. I'm going to put one last question to both of you, and I think participants would agree that this has been a very informative and very interesting conversation. But Bethlehem, for you, the question that has been put in the chat by Belaine is, what are the major steps that the regional economic communities have to take in cooperation with the AU in order to enhance the implementation of the AfCFTA? I know you've already pointed out to several things as well as challenges. You've spoken about political will, but what could we see, let's say, in the next 6 to 12 months as steps that the RECs must take in order for us to see that glass that you mentioned being half full become maybe 3/4 full or 100% full? So that's a question to you, Bethlehem. To you, Ambassador, Molly Dlamini is saying that considering that Somaliland is not a recognized country, but has recently conducted successful elections, as we've seen, but they're not a recognized country by the African Union, but yet they've declared themselves a state. How can they participate in trade through multilateralism if they don't have official representation? Other countries in the West and the Gulf states are beginning to invest and do business there. And are we not, as Africa, missing something? So I think, Ambassador, you spoke to the issues of rhetoric quite a bit and the gap between rhetoric and action. And I think this is a really interesting example. So how what is the rest of the continent missing? And also, how can Somaliland participate in trade through multilateralism if they do not have official representation and they're not recognized? So Bethlehem, I will ask you to go first, and then Ambassador, we'll come to you.
Thanks very much. So in actual terms, what we have been doing with the regional economic communities, and this is also derived from a decision of the Assembly, is the division of labor. Because the point is that we've all been doing great things, but in our own corners. So now the efforts of the AfCFTA is now to bring all these corners together and find a common platform. So like I said, this was also behind the decision of the AU turning its July summit into a mid-year coordination summit, where heads of the RECs will be now sitting with the AUC, the Secretary General of the AfCFTA, the CEO of the AUDA NEPAD, to discuss how they have been aligning their developmental agendas. And the mandate of this committee really is now, the meeting is to make sure that they harmonize all the rules in the continent so that that trickles down to the national aspect. In terms of the AfCFTA, we have also been in engagement with the RECs on implementing a decision that calls on a division of labor. So we will have to come now sit together, and that is an ongoing discussions. And like you said, from not even the following 6 to 12 months, in the following 3 months, what we expect is that this agreement will come into force and that we will be signing with the heads of RECs and the AfCFTA for a clear division of labor, where everybody now in their corner will know how to support the documents. Because at the end of the day, the efforts that we do at each corner must align, and we have to harmonize. And that, I think, is how the RECs will be able to support us. There's a platform that has already been created for that has been recognized by the Assembly, and the coordination meetings are actually planned to take place in the following 2 weeks, following which we now will be expecting reports on implementation, reports on areas of gaps where now the Assembly can push on the specific regions which are lagging in harmonizing the rules and regulations. Because both for us and also the regional economic communities, we believe it's a more political role that we can play in ensuring that member states comply and providing them with the available data, and to ensure that our efforts are not duplicated. So the efforts is both ways. AfCFTA should also make sure that some of the things that the RECs are able to do, that we give it to them, and that we also focus on other areas. And the same for the RECs. The RECs will now be focusing on specific areas, which will now be agreed by everybody sitting together, and not necessarily just a recognition by the Assembly. Because what the RECs used to have is that, yes, they're recognized by the decision of the Assembly, but there's no platform per se where now that traces back who's done what and whether they're doing the same thing. So creation of that platform already by the Assembly is a big step forward. And we believe that in the following 2 months or 3 months, we will be able to report on harmonizations, we'll be able to report on regional efforts that in a more systematic way because of the collaboration that we are under negotiations on. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Bethlehem. Thank you so much. Ambassador, can I bring you in, and then you can also make your closing remarks? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much once again. This question on Somaliland is a very interesting one, also tricky one, because I'm also one of the participants involved in the dialogue process between federal government of Somalia and Somaliland. Therefore, let me not prejudice, my response, which may be construed in a different, possibly different way, but let me generally put it this way, that yes, Somaliland is not recognized. But the question now is, why is it not recognized in a situation where you have other states that have declared their self-determination and they are recognized? South Sudan, for example, Eritrea is another one. So why Somaliland? Why are we not there yet? South Sudan came as a process, came as an outcome of a process of negotiated settlement. Similarly, the same thing also with Eritrea, which was an understanding between Addis and Asmara in 1991, 92, 93. It came through that process. That is how it was settled. Now, as far as Somaliland, Somalia is concerned, it has not been able to have a dialogue, or the dialogue has not been sustained between Mogadishu and Hargeisa. So this is one of the reasons. But as per international law, for which multilateral is also a rule-based organization, international legal personality is still with Mogadishu. And therefore, recognition of government or state is with the government in Mogadishu, and therefore Somaliland has to negotiate, has to go for dialogue. There's an ongoing dialogue, which probably will culminate in the resolution of some of these issues. Now, the Gulf, of course, they are investing a lot. They are investing a lot in our region. Somaliland is one, even in the rest of Somalia, they are investing. But also the Gulf is also exploiting some, the Gulf, the geopolitics of the Gulf, the fallout in the Gulf politics 3 or 4 years ago is one of the things that has spurred also to bring Somalia into that equation, into that dispute. And to some extent, they were almost fragmenting Somalia. The Gulf involvement was about to fragment Somalia at some point 2 or so years ago. So this is the much I can say as far as Somaliland is concerned. Now just as a remarks, parting shot from my side is two issues. One is the voice of civil society is critical when it comes to our move towards regional, cooperation, multilateral engagement. So civil society, it should be clearly, had, and also we need to have regional civil society movement as opposed to nation state civil society, which is very common. Then the second one is about there is need for us to have even to make good governance, accountability, transparency, and democratization and public participation to give meaning to it. Then we should have active devolution of power, and resources to the local level, while at the same time undertaking proactive regional integration. Active devolution of power and resources and proactive regional integration. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, and also to Ms. Bethlehem Arega. I think you have both laid out some very big ideas, some very innovative approaches, and also some very, I think, exciting options for the continent as we continue to use multilateralism to achieve, as you both have said, one of the most, I think, inventive approaches to regional cooperation, which is the Continental Free Trade Agreement, but also something that that we need to think about more actively amongst a broader spectrum of actors about how we use this to regain power as a continent. And I think Bethlehem aptly spoke about colonialism and how this is kind of a counter tool to the impact and effects of colonialism. There are still quite a number of questions in the chat that have come, that were spurred by many of your comments in the chat. So I would encourage you, both our panelists, Ambassador Mohammad Ali and Ms. Bethlehem Arega, to respond to some of those within the chat. But we will bring our panel to a close. Please allow me to, participants, to thank you both on behalf of all the participants. I think this has been a very informative, very thoughtful discussion. And thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of it. I look forward to hearing from more from both of you in different settings on this issue and others. And I think really what was incredibly useful was also how you brought together many of the issues at the nexus of peace, security, development for our continent, as well as the context, painting the context of COVID-19 very clearly within that. So Letty, thank you so much. I will hand back over to you now. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shuvai, for that excellent moderation. Is it possible you can just give us 5 minutes? Maybe we can go on a 5-minute break and then resume after 5 minutes. We're just trying to get hold of our next speakers. And I should just announce at this point now that one of our speakers, the former Chief of Staff at the African Union, Ambassador Diop, whom you know very well, is not able to join us because he has recently been appointed as a foreign minister in Mali. So he just sent us a message that he won't be able to join us today. That's unfortunate, but it is what it is. So just give us 5 minutes and then we'll resume. Possibly everybody can take a 5 minutes break and then we come back after 5 minutes. Welcome back and good afternoon again, everyone. I hope you had a nice coffee break. I just want to take a moment to thank the previous speakers and the moderator, the speakers for all your inputs, very invaluable inputs, and the moderator for excellent moderating. Shuvai, I think let's just give them a round of applause. I'm going to ask our next speakers and the moderator Ms. Nadila Bayat to come on the floor. Just a request to speak, and then I will allow you to be on the floor, and then the next session will start. Ms. Bayat, you have the floor. Over to you. Ms. Nadila,
Okay.
you have the floor, please.
Hi. Okay.
Thank you.
You can hear me. Excellent.
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, excellent. Are we joined by all of our panelists, Ms. Letty?
You have most of them.
Okay, wonderful.
Yes, you can start with the one that is already on the floor.
Okay, great.
Over to you, thanks.
Thank you, Letty. To our hosts of today's event, the Institute of Peace and Security Studies and GIZ, distinguished speakers, and to all panelists and participants who are joining us today. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to session 2 on Africa in the Global Multilateral Trading System. My name is Nadira Bayat, and I'm the Gender and Trade Expert with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And it's my distinct pleasure to join you and to serve as your moderator for today's event. Now, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, we convene, as you know, in unprecedented times. The global economic order is facing increasing challenges due to rapidly evolving global trade dynamics and an acute health and economic crisis with no parallel in modern times. Indeed, COVID-19 has been identified as the worst human and economic crisis of our lifetimes, with Africa expected to see an additional 26 million people living below the international poverty line as a result of the pandemic. But in the midst of all of this turbulence, we are also privileged to be part of history, and that is why we convene today. January 1st, 2021, as you know, marked the start of trading under the historic African Continental Free Trade Area as the only Pan-African program that enables African countries to pursue socioeconomic development and peace and security in tandem. Forged at a time of mounting trade tensions, protectionism, and an uneasy retreat from global trade commitments, the AfCFTA reaffirms Africa's positive contribution to the global multilateral trading system. Now, the AfCFTA, as you've heard, is expected to achieve an integrated African market where goods, services, people, and capital circulate freely and complement regional integration efforts to benefit over 1.2 billion Africans. Boosting intra-African trade through the elimination of tariffs and non-tariff barriers is expected to significantly spur value addition and development, both within the continent and globally, as part of resilient recovery post-COVID-19. So, notwithstanding this tumultuous time for trade, we see that the world is more connected now than ever before. Indeed, the pandemic has in many ways given renewed vigor to the need for context-specific and gender-sensitive trade policies to address poverty and inequality. Now, joining me to address a plethora of issues related to Africa in the global multilateral trading system, and that will also include new thinking around the substance of building resilience and sustainability within and among African countries, are my following renowned experts. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ms. Rosalind Ngeno, Senior Investment Expert at the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, Mr. Willie Shumba, Senior Customs Expert and Advisor at the AU Commission, and Ms. Anne Ayiba Ali at the Center for Democracy and Development, West Africa. Now, I'd like to emphasize the open nature of today's discussion. We're going to take a leaf out of the excellent moderation from session 1, and everybody is invited to participate. So we're going to start with our first speaker, Ms. Rosalind Ngeno, but I encourage you as our participants to share your views in the chat. So I will call on you, but please also post your comments in the chat, and we can raise these comments and you can expand on them as part of the discussion and during the Q&A. I'm really sure that a combination of our strong expertise and intellectual leadership from our speakers, together with the collective insights, will inform the deliverables for today's session. And I'd like to reflect briefly on these, which include the AfCFTA versus the rules of the multilateral trading system of the WTO, harnessing the push from the AfCFTA and allowing Africa to gain a solid benefit from both regional and global economic integration, expectation from member states and the RECs in harnessing the push from the AfCFTA, and the commitment of the WTO under the new leadership to recover ground that has been lost, especially in relation to development on the continent during the pandemic, and really to forge the way forward. So I'm going to call on my speakers to deliver their remarks. In keeping with the tempo of the first session, I'll ask them to introduce themselves, to tell us a little bit about their work and relate it to their opening remarks. Without any further ado, let us begin. I'd like to begin with you, Rosalind. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nadira. And thank you for the warm welcome that you have given. My name is Rosalind Ngeno. I'm the senior expert on investment at the AfCFTA Secretariat. My work is supporting the state parties and the non-state parties in the negotiation of the investment protocol by supporting in the development of the same. This afternoon, I will be speaking largely on the investment landscape in Africa and the investment protocol and the objectives of the protocol. So I'll look at the current investment outlook, the objectives of the investment protocol to address the gaps and the fragmentation we have in the continent, and what we hope to see in the continent with the negotiations of the investment protocol. And that rounds up in terms of how we are looking at the multilateral system and how we are fitting into the multilateral system and the discussions at the multilateral level. So Africa has been said to suffer from structural vulnerabilities, and commodity dependence. And that has been said by the esteemed speakers in the first session. Trade in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and this is foreign trade, is measured in terms of imports and exports of goods and services, represent more than 50%. And this is not only sub-Saharan Africa, it is the entire Africa, excluding probably one or two countries. It represents more than 50% of the GDP. This shows a great dependence on imports, not adequately balanced by corresponding exports, which means there is less investment in the productive sectors of the continent. Now, investment has always been recognized as an essential tool for development in African countries, national, regional, and continental development strategies. Concerted efforts have been put in place at the national and regional levels to attract foreign investment and to grow direct domestic investments. And over the years, Africa has received increased FDI inflows, yet we see that there is unemployment, again, abject poverty and underdevelopment, which continues to be seen in the continent of Africa. In 2019, the majority of FDI inflows to Africa came from countries other than Africa. We see the European Union, countries, Netherlands, France, United Kingdom, we see the United States and China, and some of the African countries that are investing across the continent are a handful: South Africa, Morocco, Egypt, Ivory Coast, and Togo. Investment data that we draw from UNCTAD, particularly the World Investment Report 2020, shows that the FDI inflows between 2017 and 2019 has ranged from $42 to 51 billion, with a share of a paltry 2.9% of world FDI. And that is to the entire Africa. Our share, I think currently, maybe with COVID it has dropped, but we had gotten to a point of 3% of world share. That is very, very small. 2020 projections had indicated 25 to 35 billion. Now, intra-African investment flows have been noted to be slightly higher, but growth of the same is hampered by very adverse impact of business regulations and investment facilitation. Policies, therefore, that foster economic growth, promote higher per capita incomes, expand the labor force, and improve the business environment in Africa, in the African countries, is required to facilitate intra-regional FDI. And that is what we are focusing on at within the AfCFTA framework. There are two distinct factors of hope for the recovery of investment flows to the continent in the medium to long term that have been observed. And these are the following. The first is the higher value being assigned to the ties to the continent by major global economies. We cannot do without the multilateral system. And so the ties to the continent by major global economies that are promoting investment in infrastructure, resources, but also industrial development. And the second is very encouraging. That is a deepening of regional integration under the AfCFTA. Longer term has been said, diversifying investment flows to Africa and harnessing them for structural transformation remains the key objective, which is also the key objective of the AfCFTA. Both of these objectives will require a prudent, coordinated, and timely response from countries on the continent on how they work on their internal domestic legislations. At the same time, we are working on the multilateral and continental framework on both trade and investment. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area, therefore, has the potential effectively implemented to spur both intra and inter-African investments. The extent to which the AfCFTA will attract investments depend on how the commitments and the legal instruments will be implemented and how the protocol on investment will be designed and implemented, basing it on the overall objective of promoting, facilitating, and protecting sustainable investments between the Africa continent countries by creating a modern and coherent legal framework that provides for a sound intra-Africa investment climate. The investment protocol will aim at creating a facilitative, predictable, and competitive investment environment for African investors investing in other African countries. And when there is a competitive and conducive environment for African investors, it means that the environment is also conducive for investors from third countries. Negotiations under the protocol will cover investment facilitation, promotion for sustainable development, investment protection, and responsible investment. Those are very key in terms of looking at ensuring that the Africa continent can actually build on the investments that it has, generate more investments by ensuring that we have more investors, inbuilt investors, and also investors coming in from other regions. Allow me to share the specific objectives that are envisaged of the protocol. There are a couple of them. To promote social and economic transformation for inclusive growth and sustainable development in line with Agenda 2063. To promote, facilitate, and stimulate intra-African investment flows through better harmonization and coordination of investment regimes and instruments across the regional economic communities and across Africa in general. What we see is that we have the African continent has fragmented investment regulations that do not allow for proper utilization of investment opportunities across the borders. And even within our own internal borders or country-specific borders, we are not able to utilize the opportunities that are there because of this fragmentation. Third is to strengthen the regional markets, creating wealth in Africa and enhancing competitiveness through increased production, trade, and investment flows in African countries. Fourth, to promote within member states an environment conducive to the development of a more vibrant and dynamic private sector that facilitates job creation, promotes technology transfer, supports long-term economic growth, and contributes effectively to the fight against poverty. This agreement that is being prepared or developed right now, same to the AfCFTA agreement, is not for governments. It is for the private sector. It is a private sector to utilize it for the beneficiation of the African continent. Fifth, to enhance African position in attracting FDIs, making use of the liberalization of trade in the continent that unlocks huge market potential for domesticated investments. Sixth, to resolve the challenges of multiple and overlapping memberships and expedite the regional and continental integration processes. The seventh objective and final objective is to promote compliance by investors with domestic and international norms. Now, the improvement of investment governance and the establishment of a clear, transparent, and predictable continent investment legal framework is important for attracting foreign and domestic investment. The AfCFTA protocol on investment should therefore endeavor to address barriers to investment entry in Africa, to reduce time and costs on investment approvals, to enhance transparency, to improve efficiency, and to promote investment-related cooperation and coordination across the continent, and to address fragmented investment regulatory frameworks. Investors should have direct access to effective dispute settlement mechanisms and access to remedies where their rights are violated by the host governments. At this point, I will talk about, in a sentence, the importance of the African voice in the multilateral system where we are looking at reforms in the dispute settlement system. Currently, UNCITRAL and ICSID are working at reforming the investor state dispute settlement system. Under UNCITRAL, Working Group 3, they have identified that there are both structural and fundamental changes that need to be done. But the discussions at the UNCITRAL are currently very narrow. They're just looking at the structural reforms. However, the African countries that have managed to speak or participate in these discussions that actually have a very critical effect on dispute resolution, whether we have our own dispute resolution mechanism within the African continent, is that our issues, our cross-cutting issues have been affected. The costs, the third-party funding, among many other challenges, have not been addressed at these discussions. Therefore, it is important, as these conversations are happening at the multilateral level, that we speak in order to ensure that we are protecting the policy space of our countries, because as we are negotiating our treaties and as we are negotiating particularly the investment protocol, when we negotiate a protocol that is not in tandem with what is being said at the international level, then implementation will become a difficult matter, because we have obligations at the international level and at the same time at the continental level. So we have to ensure that we find our voice and we give our suggestions, and we ensure that our voice and our policies are input into the reform processes that are going on at the multilateral level. I proceed. The AfCFTA protocol on investment can lead to enhanced cooperation and coordination of investment policy at the continental level. Governments will need to reform their investment policies to harness the investment benefits into the host economies. Most countries lack cohesive, synergized, and coordinated strategies to harness investments in the growth sectors. And so we require these coordinated efforts so that we can utilize the large market access that we have under AfCFTA. Domestic investment policies should seek to attract investment in strategic growth sectors that provide stimulus towards sustainable development, industrialization, that create quality employment and 21st century economies in the host countries. we observe that, if anything, COVID-19 pandemic has made very clear the role of government in shaping economic activity. Domestic investment policies should harmonize regulatory and institutional frameworks for investment and strengthen the linkages between foreign and domestic investors, among others. How, therefore, continental and international frameworks can be used to foster institutional cooperation, joint implementation of rules and procedures, provide cross-learning platforms, and provide forums where countries could talk about solutions to investment hurdles and learn from each other become critical at this point. To conclude, we are reframing how we look at investment to achieve sustainable development. We know investment drives prosperity in principle, but we don't just want investment at any cost. We want value investments, one that is more inclusive, more sustainable, and more responsible. We also know that economic fairness isn't an automatic outcome of commerce, as we see in many parts of the world. It is not enough to have a great investment and trade policies or agreements. To make investment work, we need strong domestic policies, social safety nets, reskilling, and smart investments. In fact, the AfCFTA has been said to offer solutions in energy, food, medicines, green products and services, and many more, to find ways to scale up beyond domestic borders. This was said by the ITC late December of 2019. Investment will find friendlier, profitable conditions in Africa than ever before. The AfCFTA will present opportunities for growth of existing companies, and I want to leave this thought in a positive note. Throughout the continent, there are over 400 companies with annual revenues exceeding $1 billion, with another more than 700 firms generating over $500 million per year. These companies can be doubled or tripled with the way we negotiate the investment treaty, with the way we implement the AfCFTA agreement. And these enterprises compete in diverse sectors and are very globally competitive. So we have opportunities within Africa to utilize the multilateral system, to put our voice in what is happening at the multilateral level, to ensure that what we want at the continent, we also present it at a multilateral level, but also to ensure that what we are expecting, we are also creating it at the domestic level. We need to create sound and conducive policies that spur this growth of these very competitive and diverse investments. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rosalind. I mean, some critically important insights emerging from your intervention, particularly as this relates to the objectives of the investment protocol. I'm sure for everybody listening today, these have been incredibly illuminating, because Rosalind, you really unpacked exactly what this protocol entails, what the objectives are in terms of promoting socioeconomic development, how it will facilitate job creation, but also emphasizing the importance of the private sector coming on board and utilizing it for the benefit of the continent. And of course, the fact that it will enhance transparency. And I think for me, what was so important was your emphasis on value-added, responsible, sustainable investment, because we don't want just any investment. We need strong value investment, and we also need the empowering domestic policies to make this investment work, and the importance of governments being able to harness investment in critically important growth sectors, and the need for coordinated efforts to be able to utilize market access under the AfCFTA. And of course, how do we attract investment in strategic growth sectors? And then the importance of lessons learned and best practice amongst African countries to be able to achieve these objectives, but also some very important issues that you raise in terms of the investor-state dispute settlement system, and the fact that it really, the conversations that we're having on the continent need to be in tandem and in sync with what is being said at the multilateral level, because if they're not, implementation then becomes difficult, and the importance of providing our suggestions, making sure that we at the table and that our voice and policies are intrinsic to the policy-making processes at the multilateral level. So thank you very much for those critically important insights, Rosalind. I'm sure we will have the opportunity to interrogate them further during the course of the Q&A. I'd now like to turn to Mr. Willie Shumba, Senior Customs Expert and Advisor at the African Union Commission. Mr. Shumba, welcome, and over to you. If you could also briefly introduce yourself and emphasize and draw the link and the connection to your work in terms of what you're doing every day to the topic at hand on Africa in the global multilateral system. Over to you, Mr. Shumba. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the time. I'm sure you can hear me. Hello? Hello?
Go ahead,
Hello,
please. We can hear you. Yes. Go ahead.
Oh, good. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Willie Shumba. I'm a senior expert and advisor in customs and trade facilitation issues. And I've also been involved in facilitating negotiations for the African Continental Free Trade Area. And my subject today is I'll basically be talking about the AfCFTA versus multilateralism. And basically, I'll be looking at the AfCFTA in the context of where it fits in the multilateral structures that we have, and the major one being the WTO, and also in the context that the AfCFTA itself, is built upon the 8 regional economic communities in Africa. Now, my starting point is to look at what a free trade area is. We all are aware of the WTO definition of a free trade area. And you will find that the AfCFTA fits into that context. The WTO Article 24, for those of you who are academics or trade lawyers, you will recognize that the free WTO defines a free trade area as a group of 2 or more customs territories in which duties and other restrictive regulations of commerce have been eliminated on substantially all trade between the constituent territories in products originating in such territories. Now, that element on its own, it fits in the AfCFTA in the context of the WTO, in that you are having 55 African countries. It's a facility for 55 African countries, so that they are able to trade amongst each other duty-free on goods which originate in the continent. And when you look at that, and also considering that the AfCFTA is an amalgamation, the pillars of the AfCFTA are the 8 regional economic communities. That is your CENSAD, your COMESA, your the EAC, Economic Community of Central Africa States, the ECOWAS, IGAD, SADC, and UMA. You will find that the AfCFTA fits very well in the multilateral trading system, either within the continent or at the global level. Because at the global level, a free trade area are actually building blocks for a liberalized world economy. And in that respect, the AfCFTA is actually a contribution to liberalization of global trade. Although in specific, you can argue and you can say it is looking at the continent of Africa. Now, coming on to the AfCFTA, I'm glad my colleagues have covered some of the issues in that the AfCFTA itself has got three phases. Phase one, which covered the negotiations on the agreement itself, the protocol on trade in goods, trade in services, and also the protocol on dispute settlement. These were the phase one issues. And currently, we do have phase two issues which are going on, which is the investment, issues pertaining to investment, competition policy, intellectual property rights, and we also have phase three issues, which will be on e-commerce. So, based on this, although one is looking at liberalizing trade in Africa, liberalizing the trading regime in Africa, but you cannot deny the fact that you cannot overlook the fact that by liberalizing trade in Africa, it's actually a contribution towards liberalizing trade in the global environment. Now, I have mentioned the various phases, trade in goods, and I've also said trade in services. And trade in services, currently they are focusing on 5 priority areas, which is your professional services, the ICT, financial services, tourism, and transport services. These are the areas which are going to be liberalized for the continent, for trade in services within the continent. And also trade in goods is also quite a wide area. Now, what are the opportunities which are going to come as a result of a liberalized trading regime? Well, it will create an open market for 1.35 billion people in Africa. It will create duty-free access to goods in the continent. Rosaline has adequately covered the investment opportunities that will come. It also creates industrialization and value chains and production in goods. It also results in trade facilitation measures being implemented in the AfCFTA. The elimination of NTBs through the NTB mechanism. And most important, it introduces a rule-based trade regime. Now, for each of these areas which I have mentioned as benefits arising out of the AfCFTA, I'll also argue that there is also a global dimension to it. For example, when you talk about investment, you are talking about investment which is opening up investment to Africa, and also foreign investment as well. When you talk of industrialization and value chains, you are talking of opportunities for investors and even for our local manufacturers to industrialize and create value chains so that Africa can be able to trade within itself. But when Africa trades within itself, especially by manufacturing goods through this industrialization and value chains, the impact of it is you are also supplying goods to the global market. You are manufacturing goods which will not only find their market in Africa, but also for the global market. And when you talk of trade facilitation issues, you can talk of trade facilitation within the AfCFTA, but trade facilitation measures have got a tendency of benefiting even other people who are outside the AfCFTA. You talk of utilization of NTB mechanism. By coming up with a system to eliminate NTB, you are also looking at the global market benefiting. So all in all, what it basically means is the AfCFTA is a trading regime to boost intra-Africa trade in Africa. But at the same time, it cannot be overlooked that it fits very well into the multilateral global system, and it will result in benefits even to those who might be outside the continent. Then, in conclusion, the AfCFTA as a free trade area, as we all know, a free trade area must comply with the WTO provisions. So that's another aspect which also brings the AfCFTA into the global multilateral trading regime, in that FTAs must comply with WTO provisions. There are various WTO provisions governing FTAs. And in an FTA, you can allow trade facilitation measures amongst the members, but you can also go beyond. The trade facilitation measures can actually benefit outsiders as long as the outsiders are not prejudiced. And the fact that the AfCFTA has got to comply with WTO measures, it also means that it will be utilizing requirements for international best practices in a number of areas, such as trade facilitation, standards, customs procedures, etc., including trade facilitation measures. So all in all, what I can say is the AfCFTA, it fits very well. It advances the cause of trade liberalization even beyond the continent. I think on that score, I thank you very much for your time and for listening to this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shumba. And again, some incredibly important insights and clarifications emerging from your presentation. And thank you very much for just taking us back to what is the AfCFTA, the raison d'etre, just explaining and unpacking the three phases. What does phase one entail? What does phase two entail? Phase three, and of course, reminding us and reinforcing the global dimension of the AfCFTA. That we see through investment, as Rosalind has explained, through industrialization in value chains, and the fact that when value chains are created and when Africa trades with itself, the impact is the supply of goods to global market, the importance of trade facilitation measures, the fact that these are not just Africa-specific measures, but they have the tendency to benefit those outside as well. The same with the non-tariff barrier mechanism. You're looking at a global market that's benefiting. So really, we're talking about the AfCFTA of intra-African trade, but it is in fact beneficial to all. It benefits those on the continent and in the global system. And of course, you emphasize the importance of free trade areas, complying with WTO provisions, and the fact that the AfCFTA must comply with WTO measures and utilize requirements for best practice, trade facilitation, standards and customs procedures. So in this way, we see that the AfCFTA is very much addresses the multilateral dimension of that. Indeed, the AfCFTA agreement is consistent with the WTO agreement, and it has been designed in such a way in that it does not operate counter to the spirit of the WTO, particularly as this relates in support for a rules-based system for free trade. With that, I would like to call upon our third panelist, and I'm really excited to hear her, Ms. Anne Ayiba Ali from the Center for Democracy and Development in West Africa, because of course we know, Ms. Ayiba Ali, that good governance and no corruption lies at the heart. It lies at the core of a successful AfCFTA. So we really want to hear from you about how we're going to achieve this. Thank you. Over to you, Ms. Ali.
Thank you very much, Bayat. Rightly so. Democracy is closely linked with intertrading. I hope you can all hear me. I seem to have a little issue with connection, but I hope you can all hear me.
We can hear you loud and clear. Please go ahead.
Can you all hear me?
We can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I can see some messages in the chat saying I should go ahead. I believe.
We can hear you. You're
Okay,
good.
thank you very much.
Please go ahead.
All
Thanks.
right, thank you very much. Thank you for the privilege to speak on this forum. I've patiently listened to all the distinguished panelists who have spoken from their wide range of experience, and it has been very, very enlightening, I must say. Thank you for the privilege once again. I'm going to go right into the topic I've been given to discuss, and I'll be talking about the expectations from member states and RECs in harnessing the push for the AfCFTA and the commitment of the WTO under the new leadership, particularly to recover the lost ground for COVID-19. And also, I'll be talking about a few ways forward. Now, it is known to all that Africa has a history of exporting outside the shores of Africa. And that is why intra-trading is coming at a time like this. It is very important and cannot be overemphasized. It is just like the previous speaker has said, it is very well in line with the WTO principles, and it is also very important. About 3.6% in the year 2019 to 2020 was forecasted as an average of the growth in Africa, with the world's fastest growing economies being on the continent. Africa is still heavily reliant on commodity and agricultural exports, while importing capital goods or food predominantly from outside the continent. You find a situation where Africa exports cocoa and imports chocolates back into Africa. Now, intertrading under the regime of the AfCFTA would help in a situation where we can work together. The previous speaker in the first session, Bethlehem, talks about how we can grow together as a continent, how we can grow together. The united we stand, divided we fall, that we can grow together as a continent. One of the things that the deputy director of the WTO said is that the link between membership between the AfCFTA and the WTO is important because it helps to knit the fragmented continent of Africa together. Every country seeks to gain peace, seeks to gain development, and that is what the partnership with AfCFTA and WTO will do to share a common goal and a common heritage. I thank the speaker before me for going into the 3 phases of the agreement, but I also want to take time out to talk about the 2 prominent key of the phase of the first agreement, which is the agreement in respect of goods, and the AfCFTA agreement in terms of services. And one of the aims of the AfCFTA agreement with respect to goods is the progressive elimination of tariffs. This has been said over and over and through all the panelists today, and the progressive elimination of non-tariff barriers. This is what the AfCFTA seeks to achieve, enhancing the efficiency of custom trade facilitation and transit. And then I'll just run over to what also are the aims in the agreement with respect to services. Enhancing the competition of services. Ms. Roslyn, when she was talking, made every emphasis on investment, and then promoting sustainable development to foster the investment and progressively liberalize trade and services within the Africa continent. I hope we are still following me. Now, what are the expectations from member states and from RECs? The regional economic communities, just like one of the speakers said, are like building blocks. The AfCFTA has recognized them as building blocks in this agreement. They are to implement the agreement between member states and the Secretariat. Are we still following? I hope. Please drop your chat if you can still hear me so that I know I'm not just speaking to myself.
We can still hear you, Anne. It's fine.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yes. So against this backdrop, intra-African trade remains below its potential, accounting for about 7% of the total African trade volume. This was as at 2017. This is against over 51% of exports in the Asia, 69% in the European country. You can see that the margin is wide. But when we work together as a continent, we'll be able to surpass this margin. That is the hope. We talked about this agreement, not while it has been slow, at least we are looking at it from an eye of being a half glass full. And working together is the key. This cannot be overemphasized. In the first session, we talked about political will and how that could be a challenge. But this is one of the expectations from member states, that they would have the political will, not just to see this through, but also to domesticate internal policies, as has been said earlier, to ensure that the structures, the preferences are put in order and are put in place. It is expected that also the regional economic communities will also trade on their own, just like Bethlehem informed us. They are expected, the roles that are given to them would be taken away from them. It would be expected that they would also perform their role, while also being a bridging gap to ensure that implementation of the AfCFTA also comes into existence. So there are a few expectations from the RECs. Part of it, which is that they would help to mediate on disputes, that they would help to implement the project. They'll help to create. I also think that the RECs can help in some form, as much as nation states have their sovereignty and they have a right to be sovereign in that department, that they also can help to bring about the willpower, political will of their member states in trying to ensure that they see reasons why intra-Africa trade is important. As has been earlier stated also, yes, implementation may not be on the same level, and the same thing also with the RECs may not be on the same level, because there are some RECs that are much more developed, much more organized than others. So it will not be on the same level. The main thing is to carry everyone along, and that is what this agreement has come to do. Their economies and that are much smaller than others, and their challenges of infrastructure. When you talk about intra-African trade, intercontinental trade, these are challenges that faces us, but they are not challenges that, as if we are working together as a continent, we would not be able to overcome. There are expectations from the member states, and some of these expectations that they would make themselves custom ready, they would make themselves make policies that aligns to these areas as much as possible. Member states are also expected to put in place transit certificate, border certificate, the certificate of origin, which is also a key instrument in this agreement, are things that member states should make ready. And that is why when we're talking about the number of states that have submitted their instrument of ratification, there are still a lot number of states that have not done that, because these preferences have not been put in order. One question that comes to mind will now be, what can be done to help these other states that have not gotten on board to get on board? I feel that this is one place where the RECs can come in and be able to bridge this gap. What then is the commitment of the WTO? The new leadership particularly. It has been said earlier that the COVID-19 has hit on the economy of all states. It has become glaring that we need to work together. It has become glaring that poverty is real, and intra-African trade promises to lift Africans out of poverty. So this is one thing that we need to work together on. This is one thing that we need to do as a continent. There remains a couple of members of the WTO and observers have signed on to the AfCFTA, and this shows their alliance with this agreement, and it is a step in the right direction. The Director General has also said and stressed that the need for global trade flow to also continue in order to lift nation states out of the impact of COVID-19, to drive a sustainable development in the economies of states. This was one of the things that was said in the trade stock taking event in March. What then can be the way forward? What are the way forward? Intra-African trade, I have said from the beginning, is very important, cannot be overemphasized. It is important for achieving any sustainable development in any country. And one of the things that His Excellency, the Secretary General of the Secretariat, has said is that this is a goal that would carry along over 1.3 African, and it's been forecasted that in the next, maybe in 2035, 100 million Africans will be pulled out of poverty if everything goes well with this agreement. The African payment, one of the things that have been put in place, particularly with the Secretariat, and as Bethlehem has also said, is that certain things have been put in place. There's been a payment platform. This payment platform is to ensure that currencies among states is easy to transact. That is, different African states can transact even in their local currency, and makes it very, very easy for that. This is all in a bid to facilitate the implementation of this agreement. I remember Bethlehem also talked about a financing facility that was put in place. These are also things that the Secretariat is doing to ensure that this agreement is implemented. And this is not just targeted now at states, but even at businesses within the states, small-scale businesses, medium and small-scale businesses, the young women, the youth are the focus of this financing facility. Another thing is digital platform that has been created. And this flows directly from the impact of COVID-19, that everything is going digital. And there's also a digital platform that makes the connectivity of Africans very easy. Now, if these things are put in place and implemented, and we get political will that we desire from member states, and we get the cooperation from the RECs and WTO on all this arrangement, I think that just like the first moderator said, we'll be looking at the glass just almost a quarter full or 100%. And I would like to close with what the Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development said. And I'd like to just read from that what the pandemic made clear to us is that we must ensure that trade and investment provide maximum development footprint in partner countries. The ultimate shock of the COVID-19 crisis will be poverty, and programs like Aid for Trade are essential to build forward, to forward better. Without a sustainable trade and investment flow, the strong, resilient, inclusive and green recovery we strive for will not be realized. As we forge ahead only by working together with the right political leadership, we will be able to tackle the challenge ahead. So I hope that nations can see the importance, states can see the importance of what the AfCFTA is bringing on board and would jump in and ensure that both on the African level, on the continent level, and internally, policies are put in place and states are ready to take it to the next level. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anne. Also some critically important issues emerging from your intervention. And I think what has become very clear during the course of today's discussion, and certainly reinforced by Anne, is the importance and the power of policy. My takeaway from you, and certainly, and I think this is a good segue into one of the questions that we've received on the chat and that we haven't addressed yet, is on national implementation strategies, because of course, we want to understand how countries are going to be implementing the AfCFTA. This is critically important, and you did refer to the importance of. It came out during the course of your presentation, the fact that countries need to increase their manufacturing capacities through stronger industrial plans, the need for stronger and increased infrastructure development of digital platforms, and of course to bring those smaller and more reluctant countries that may be concerned about ratifying immediately due to the advantages that may be inherent, particularly for the larger economies, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt. There are also other important factors that need to come out, regional value chains and the potential for regional value chains to involve larger industries, and how can they source their supplies from smaller industries across borders, women-owned businesses. So these are the kind of conversations that we need to start having at the national level. And I think that's a good segue into one of the questions that have been posted on the chat from Shengin Glovu, who talks about, while MSMEs are indeed the drivers of economies, a lot of these entities lack the capacity to navigate trade agreements, which include the AfCFTA agreement. So what are we doing differently? We know this. We know that particularly for women-owned businesses, navigating complex trade agreements, rules of origin, certificates are a challenge, and they have gender-distinct challenges that can be traced down to educational disparities. So what are we learning from at the RECs level? And a lot of what you said, Anne, is also, lessons learned and best practices. What have we learned at the RECs level? What are we scaling up and doing better in the context of the AfCFTA? Shengi says that research says that it is the big companies that benefit from trade agreements, while the smaller MSMEs are left behind. And of course, COVID-19 has disproportionately negatively impacted MSMEs. and we know that women-owned MSMEs have been hit hardest. Now, how should national strategies that are implementing the AfCFTA agreement, because we know that the AfCFTA agreement was negotiated at the continental level, but implementation will take place at the national level. And when we just juxtapose this reality against a COVID-19 induced environment, how should these national AfCFTA implementation strategies reflect these realities? And if I could ask maybe Willie, if you could come in on this and just talk to us a little bit about implementation at the national level. Thank you. Mr. Shumba, is it okay for you to answer that question?
Yes, I'll chip in. I'll chip in on that question. You have raised very pertinent issues about implementation at national level. I think I'll refer to what some of my colleagues have said. The AfCFTA is an international agreement negotiated by 55 African countries. And what it basically means is, at the political level, they have sought the tone, they have created an agreement, and implementation of this agreement, as has been rightly pointed out, is actually at the national level. And even when you go to the national level, implementation of this agreement, I think Rosalind also mentioned this during her presentation, implementation at national level rests with the private sector. What our governments have done is to create an architecture for the private sector to identify what they want in other African countries and buy, what any trader would want. So implementation rests the starting point, the common denominator, the lowest point is actually at the national level. And it becomes very important that at national level, we have national implementation structures and strategies. And I am fully aware that Nadira, your organization, UNECA, has played a very important role in setting up, in assisting member states establish national implementation strategies and the national implementation structures. Actually, a few days ago, a team from UNECA was in Malawi, assisting Malawi to come up with a national implementation strategy. So, so it's very important that we have very strong, effective national implementation structures and strategies which encompass everyone, the various government departments, your revenue authorities, your ministries responsible for trade, your agriculture departments, your SMEs, your chambers of commerce, everyone, your civil society. All these issues must be very strong at national level. And if it is at national level that you have these strong structures, that you can have people from national level who can identify markets to penetrate, opportunities to take advantage of, and how they are going to enter into those markets. All these issues are part of the national implementation strategies which must be implemented. So I think this is what I can say in sum up. The important thing is our governments have created a structure and a framework for governments and the national structures to take advantage of. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Shumba. I couldn't have said it better. That's a phenomenal summary of the critical importance and what needs to be done at the national level. We just have a few minutes, and I'm just going to give Rosalind and then Anne the opportunity to make closing remarks. I think you can all, I'm not going to read out Rosalind's comment and response to an important question on the chat, but I will encourage you to read it. The question from Mr. Mohammed: how can countries be cooperative on on the investment way, specifically in terms of implementation. And Rosalind at the AfCFTA Secretariat has set out a very comprehensive response. So I would encourage you to read that response in the chat. But Rosalind, I'm going to ask you just very high-level takeaways, and then over to you, Anne. So if you can identify, if you can highlight factors that will determine the AfCFTA's success, particularly as this relates to generating employment opportunities for all African, and particularly for African women and for youth, in stimulating investment while ensuring African countries derive greater benefit from the multilateral trading system. Rosalind, what would be some of your high-level takeaways? If you can just respond in 2 minutes, and then Anne, over to you, and we conclude the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadira. And thank you for all the presenters for the very insightful presentations. I can highlight a couple of factors. One is the legal framework. The legal framework that affects both the investment facilitation, that affects cross-border movement, that needs to be addressed. If the domestic legislation still remains the same, then the situation remains the same. We need to change our legislative framework to adapt to what we want in our countries and in the continent. It needs to be conducive to the investor, but at the same time, it needs to give or generate, the value investments that we want. Now, in terms of generating the value investments that we want, when we have inflows of investments, we also need to check these investments. Are these investments supporting quality jobs, or they're just supporting, jobs like cleaners and things like that? But we want quality jobs, for instance, of course, plus other jobs. Are they supporting supplier linkages at the domestic level? Would they do that? Are they giving us the latest technology? And when we look at that, and when we have the opportunity to evaluate and say, no, we need your investment to do A, B, C, D. But of course, remember that an investor is coming into a space to make profits. And that is the bottom line, profits. But as they make the profits, what are the benefits that can accrue? So the legislation is important. The other matter, final, because I can say a lot about this, is we need a lot of capacity building and awareness creation, particularly to the youth and the women. At the level operation they are at the moment is maybe too small within the economy to move out into the regional markets. But when we build their capacity to ensure that what they are producing, particularly those that are producing goods, and also services, we build their capacity that the goods and services are standard, then they can start trading across borders. We can start trading and utilizing the markets that are available across from us, and also educating them and teaching them how the cross-border management is after the AfCFTA has been ratified in each of their economies. So that training awareness, both to understand how they can leverage on the AfCFTA in terms of the rules themselves, first of all, but also in terms of the capacities to produce good quality goods and services. Thank you, Nadira.
Thank you so much, Rose. Rosalind, such important issues. We need to change our legislative framework, and we need to adapt it to what we want. And of course, we want quality jobs. We want decent and productive employment for our women and youth. We need to ensure that investment supports supplier linkages. Are we getting the latest technology and capacity building and training? And, I encourage you to go back to our agreement, AfCFTA agreement, familiarize yourself with the provisions in the agreement, because there are provisions in that agreement that make provision for capacity building, technical assistance, and training needs. And we need to be able to utilize our agreement and to leverage it to empower our women, our youth, and to create the Africa we want. So thank you very much for those rich and important insights, Rosalind. Anne, over to you for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Bayat. For me, I want to emphasize on the national interest. Nations are driven by national interest, and where they can see a clear picture that this agreement is actually targeted at achieving sustainable development, they drive the force better. So I want to emphasize that national interest is made much more clearer, and also that they work with stakeholders, that is at the domestic level. There are private stakeholders involved in this. There's medium and small scale businesses involved in this. So it is a stakeholder affair. That means that they work together to ensure that the provisions of the AfCFTA is implemented in the state. I also want to talk again on infrastructure, and that states do their best to ensure that the right infrastructures are put in place, because even if other states, the doctrine of reciprocity also comes in here. If one state is ready to trade and another is not ready to trade because they don't have the necessary infrastructure, it's still a pullback on this agreement. So they need to have the right infrastructures in place. They need to be driven by national interest, and that means that the state understands why this agreement is coming in at a time like this, and why it is important, and why there should be the political will is also very important. And they need to work as a team, all stakeholders involved, the private, the government, the small and medium enterprises, the young women, everybody working together also cannot be overemphasized. I think for me, this will be my parting words. Thank you very much, Bayat, and all the panelists for having me on this forum today.
Thank you so much, Anne. And I love how you call me Bayat, even though it is my last name. But that's fine. So, of course, very important. Nations are driven by national interests and the political will, and the importance of states understanding exactly why they're here, what is the agreement for, who is the agreement for. And I think that is the beauty of the AfCFTA national strategies, because implemented correctly, drafted correctly, this serves as a vehicle for inclusivity, because at the national level, through AfCFTA national committees, through monitoring and evaluation committees, through communication and visibility plans, we can ensure that we get all the stakeholders around the table. So this may be a plan, an implementation strategy that is driven by the Ministry of Trade, but it brings other critical policymakers around the table. It gives informal cross-border trader associations the opportunities, gives women's business associations, it gives youth, it gives the media. So it's so important when we're talking to our policymakers for us to be empowered with the knowledge that to implement the AfCFTA agreement, we need to have national strategies in place. And we all have a role in the design of that national strategy, and to make sure that it is implemented correctly, even as part of the monitoring and evaluation mechanisms that are created, even as part of civil society forums. So the onus is on us as part of this larger ecosystem of support to ensure the success of the AfCFTA as equal custodians of this historic Pan-African agreement. With that, thank you, colleagues and friends. Thank you for joining us. To our participants, thank you to the IPSS and to GIZ for convening this critically important discussion. I'm sure that you can all agree with the first session set the tone for a phenomenal discussion that our speakers in the second session certainly matched. So thank you for your time, and Letty, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nadila, for your excellent moderation, and to all the speakers for their invaluable insights and for teasing out most of the issues that we wanted to hear today. I think, shall we give them a big round of applause? Thank you so much. We've now come to the end of our webinar. Very interesting insights have been shared by all the speakers with practical recommendations. Moving forward, IPSS hopes to work with the AfCFTA Secretariat in Accra, Ghana, to see how together we can generate knowledge and also do some research in terms of some of the issues that have been tabled here today, and especially in the nexus of peace and security, but also development and multilateralism that can be widely disseminated to stakeholders on the continent in terms of implementation of the trade agreement. I would like to thank all our speakers and their moderators for their invaluable insights and recommendations, and the summaries made by the moderators are very useful indeed going forward. And I would also like to thank our technical partner, GIZ, for the collaboration on today's webinar. Last but not least, I thank all participants who managed to log on today, and also for their inputs and insights are very useful today indeed. We've come to the end of today's webinar, and we hope to see you in the next one soon. So thank you so much once again, and it's goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye. Let's
Bye. Thank you so much.
Okay.